Thank you for your presentations today. My name's Major Michael Leisingring. A question about combined arms, Professor Evans. You started sort of with the historical with Gustav Adolphus. I'm interested, and then mentioned the Germans in the Austrian Wars, 1866. Did the Americans in the American Civil War develop a combined arms at all as part of their Civil War?
Is it on? Look, the American Civil War is a very important war. The reason I didn't mention it, A, because of time, C, because it's un-European. It's, you know, I was sticking to the European as we were dealing with the Western Front. But you're right, it's a very important war, even though it was ignored by most European military theorists. But there you get the first inklings of what's going to go wrong on the Western Front. You know, stalemate, the power of rifled weapons. Artillery is still not as sophisticated as it was to become in the first part of the 20th century. But you know, a smart military theorist would have taken notice of that war, but many Europeans didn't. They just regarded it as a bunch of American amateurs, with the occasional general like Lee standing out who was Napoleonic, as opposed to Grant, who was, of course, a much more modern general, but didn't look the part. So, yeah, I mean, the literature, again, is massive, and if I haven't dealt with it, it's mainly because of time, but you're right, it's a marvellous area to study.
Okay. Yes, up the back.
Thanks. This is addressed to any of the speakers. What was the actual process of learning? Because you mentioned Monash there, and he gets a great rap for being one of the early ones to employ these tactics. But if you read, for example, any of the biographies of Haig, there is the claim there that there was a far broader learning process which was established within the British military high command system, and that it wasn't necessarily all the genius of the Australians that led to the development in this area. So I was just wondering if you could explain how the process has actually worked and how the lessons were transmitted.
In the British system, I mean, as I said, right from the very earliest days of the war, there's a learning and adaptation process going on. In the early days, it's very loose, it's not very well disseminated. But for the British, once you get into 1916, there's very definitely a system starting to emerge. And that is, as soon as there's some sort of action or battle, people are required to write reports. Those reports are collated, they're sort of pushed up through the system, and indeed, eventually the British adopt a system where you actually meant to submit these reports anonymously. So the idea is that junior officers who might feel intimidated about sending something critical of their commander have this ability to do this. The French adopt a similar system as well of sort of anonymous, allowing anonymous submissions. And that sort of percolates upwards. There are doctrine, what we would call, called doctrine cells are created at various levels up at General Headquarters as well. From that, pamphlets, training new doctrine comes out, and that is used in the school system. There's an extensive training system behind the line, and then that comes. So it's a bit of a bottom up, top down. It's not all bottom up, and it's not all top down. It goes both ways. That's at the sort of tactical level. When it comes to Haig, well, Haig certainly due a lot of criticism. You have to give Haig some credit. In 1918, he does seem to finally get it. That he's looked at the tactical advances that have been made, and what he finally twigs to in 1918 is you don't start an offensive and then just keep going. In 1918, he finally gets it that actually you start it up, you do it for a couple of days and you shut it down. He's not the first one to come to that. The big development that happens in 1917, in my view, sort of at the operational level, if you like, is actually a French one. In 1917, the French give up on the decisive battle. They're really the only ones to do it in the war. The British start to do it in 1918, the Germans never do it. So in 1917, the French think, all right, we're sequencing battles now. And in 1918, Foch will make that the basic premise of what becomes the 100 days.
So another question. Yes, down the back, and F, you can be next.
I'm a doctor in the Army Reserve Medical Corps, so I've always got to ask the medical question. Do we have a mechanised field ambulance or equivalent? Part of the reason I ask is I've just finished reading about the battles in Palestine in 1917 and 1918, where we had light horse field ambulances to keep up with the light horse, which were actually doing the fighting. It was a tremendous challenge of time, space and numbers.
Can you comment on
What fields I actually read? So I can say that much.
Well, a little bit, not precise. I can't give you a precise answer. You know, there is a fair bit of mechanisation of all logistic functions, including medical. The first few 100 metres is almost always some poor sucker carrying a stretcher. But once you get to a certain point, yeah, there's going to be an ambulance or some other mode of transportation. So that is going on, but it's, as I said, that first few 100 metres at least, until you get to somewhere where a vehicle can safely pull up, is going to be somebody carrying you.
No, that was my understanding too. It was quite simply that the casualty collection point was placed almost quite rear with a mandrolic means to recover the casualty back. In terms of how you then extracted them further, it was reliant on the cars, trucks, flatbeds at the time, is my understanding. But I don't have a depth of knowledge on that one.
Thanks very much. The only blue suitor in the room, I guess I'm in good company. I have two questions. One, I'm a bit of a student of Colonel John Monash's experience at the First Battle of Bullecourt and the experience he had with tanks and, of course, the mixed opinions of artillery use. And what changed his mind at Hamel to trust the tanks? Second question, you talked about the change from Canberra in terms of understanding the tactics that they had learned throughout the early years of the war. How did the industrial capacity meet the demand?
So, who would like to answer either of those, industrial capacity or Monash?
I'll have a quick go and then I'll turn it over. With Monash, I've always thought the key to Monash's genius is the fact he was an engineer in an age where the Napoleonic spirit still predominated. So he was profoundly modern, and he wasn't a career soldier. I think that helped as well. So that's, to me, is the quite simple answer to Monash. That may be a simplistic answer, but that I've always seen. In some ways, he's the prototype for the kind of officer that is to come in the 20th century. So he's ahead of his time. He has a grip and a grasp. That's, you know, it's not for nothing that multiple writers have regarded him as the best general on the Western Front, along with Curry, the Canadian. I think that reputation is held up for almost 100 years now. So that's a tremendous plus for us in Australia. I still think he's our greatest soldier. Blamey notwithstanding, I'm not a Blamey fan.
It's certainly hard to like Blamey, that's for sure. I'm going to be the contrarian, and I'm going to prick the Monash balloon a little bit. Look, Monash does an excellent job at Hamel. It's a very well-planned battle. There's no doubt about that. That Monash is somehow alone in that capacity, I don't agree with at all. As the Battle of Cambrai, okay, there are faults with the Battle of Cambrai, undoubtedly. Monash had his faults too. He didn't always get it right. You know, Cambrai, well before Monash as a corps commander, demonstrates the way that the British Army, at the broader sense, is approaching war by the winter of 1917, 1918. And there's other stuff going on the Western Front with other people. Okay, McCurry's one. There's some pretty good British corps commanders as well. Monash is only a corps commander. Okay, he's a good one, but he never commands anything higher than a corps. The interesting comparison that indeed Peter Pedersen makes in his Monash's military commander is with General Charles Manjon's 10th Army on the 18th of July. Okay, Monash is the 4th of July at Hamel. You compare that to what the French, with a few American divisions thrown in, do on the 18th of July. It's a full-on combined arms battle, and it's a hell of a lot bigger than Hamel. You know, we're talking about 1,000 tanks, enormous amounts of artillery, and a planning cycle that puts in an army plus attack in under 5 days. It's genuinely impressive. So Monash is not the only one.
Okay. Just down the front there.
Industrial capacity. Yeah, look, by 1917, industry is producing enormous amounts of guns, shells, and that's been a problem up until then. By 1917, they're getting a lot of equipment. By 1918, they're getting so much they almost don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, you mentioned Yom Kippur, and you mentioned up there it says never fight alone. Tobruk was a good example of what happens to armoured division when it gets isolated from its infantry. The Aussies let the armour roll over them and get past them and wiped out the infantry, and the armour were contained, funneled into minefields, and British anti-tank gunners basically wiped the panzers out because they were separated from their infantry.
You want to make a comment on that?
No, it was a good statement.
Right, okay. Good statement, right, okay.
No, so I'm in agreement. I'm an advocate, absolute advocate. And it's the way we're instructing. We're going through all of our Army Continuum of Officer training. We're certainly hyping on that at the moment, and for the right reasons. I mean, these historical conferences are key to reinforcing where those lessons have been born, but the current teaching and doctrine reinforce it every turn.
General Gow, you appear to have the microphone there.
Yes, Steve Gow. John, I'm pleased you made those points about Monash. I think there's been some publications recently about Monash. Roland Perry and Tim Fisher were hagiographies which divorce from reality, quite frankly. And I think we need to pick up that comment about the British. The name of Monash's commander escapes me, but he was involved in Hamel, whether we like it or not from the Australian point of view. And I think there's a danger of overemphasising that aspect. But thank you for making those comments. I can't help but try and defend Blamey. I'll make two comments. Firstly, he commanded much longer at the top than Monash did. He commanded successfully at the top, ruthlessly at times. Some of you may remember a very good gunner, Major General Tim Cape. Yes. He got a DSO for air support working for Blamey, and he talked to me just before he died about how he came forward to be briefed by Blamey, and he said it was the most magnificent brief he has received from anyone. He knew what Blamey wanted, the commander's intent, and he was given the latitude to go out and implement it, and which he did successfully. So I think we just dismissed Blamey. We remember too much the comments. Some people said that Joe Lyons said this, that he complained to Bob Menzies when Menzies appointed him in charge of the RAF forces in the Middle East. And Lyons reportedly said, "Oh, that's shocking. He's a womaniser, he drinks, he patronises place of ill repute. We can't have this man as commander of Australian troops." And Menzies says, "All what you say is true, but I want a commander of men, not a Sunday school teacher." One comment I would like to ask. Now, our much acclaimed C.W. Bean doesn't really mention artillery at all in all his volumes. I think that's a fact. He doesn't talk anything about armour, to my recollection. Do you think this is a problem at all in terms of a record of the First World War, the Australian record? The books are acclaimed by everyone. Artillery and its decisiveness, particularly in 1917 and 18, doesn't really get mentioned. But Mark, would you like to comment on that?
Trying to restrain myself.
Well,
look, I'm not a fan of Charles Bean, I have to admit. This is a man who began his career as a journalist, extolling the virtues of the Royal Australian Navy. And if you read his early career, Flagships 3, he's telling us that we are the blood of English seamen, that we're the descendants of Drake and Raleigh. And then off the AIF goes, and suddenly we are the bronze bushmen, the legendary descendants of the Athenians and the Spartans. I think he's a propagandist of the First Order. I mean, that may upset some of you in this audience, but it doesn't surprise me that he neglects artillery, because it's the bushman legend, it's the infantry digger. That's the legend of Australian military history. It's a wonderful national narrative, and I do not think it helps the profession of arms. That's my view, for what it's worth.
Okay. Don't restrain yourself.
Well, actually, I pretty much would say something fairly similar to that. But you know, there is a new range of really quite good scholarship on the AIF, which you know, Bean's monumental history is impressive, and we're never going to be completely free of its influence. But since then, there's a lot of really good scholarship on the AIF. I can highly recommend the AIF in Battle, edited by Jean Bou, available at quite reasonable prices, and indeed has an excellent chapter in there on Garth Pratton on the development of the AIF's artillery. And I would encourage you to seek it out as gunners for that chapter, if none other. You know, I've recently been rereading Peter Pedersen's book on Monash. It's a really good book. You know, it's more than 20 years old now, but it really is a genuinely very good. Peter Pedersen's very opinionated, and sometimes you can see, if you know Peter Pedersen, he's an interesting cat. But he's, you know, it's a really good book, and there are lots of others.
Good, thank you. How again? One over there.
Good evening. Thanks a lot for your time. It's been bloody excellent. How to form this? As you've said, at Canberra, a lot of these technological advances and different doctrinal or otherwise low-level tactics are developed that enabled the edge. As you were saying, sir, to find an edge is to find the strength of the enemy. But these days, with all those technological advances over such enemies as we've seen in the counterinsurgency of the last 10, 15 years, how can we develop our tactics further, even though we have reached such an elated height of technology? Because at the end of the day, combined arms, as you've said, is very effective. But what happens when the other side doesn't come out to play in a way? How can we go from here?
So I think what I'll probably say to that is absolutely we're trying to go for the technological advantage, but also spoke about the doctrinal. So it's how you use it then, and whether we're now considering the problem in the right frame, and how we frame the actual problem in terms of your exact example being a counterinsurgency, whether we've framed the problem of a counterinsurgency correctly, and thereby are we employing the technology that we've got correctly, or we're now just showing the weaknesses rather than mitigating and using our strengths. So maybe it's more of a how we use it as opposed to what we've got.
Well, you've had one already, so it's just, yes, you're on. We'll have time, but let's just see.
Dr. Evans, I was struck by your comment regarding the Civil War and how the European powers basically disregarded it as a colonial battle or colonial war wouldn't affect how they were going to operate. And I put this to the whole panel. In your readings, are you seeing a similar sort of approach to what we're seeing in the Ukraine and the Russians' way of war? And are we as a Western nations not picking up on some obvious lessons on the future of combined arms and how we're going to fight in the future?
That's a very good question. I think while we've been obsessed with Islamic guerrillas and insurgents, and the Russians and the Chinese have been busy looking at the major trends in peer-related military conflict on land, sea and air and in the joint areas. So the advantages we've had in the so-called unipolar moment where American military power was without peer, that's eroding so rapidly now. And the Americans are going into now an offset strategy because they realize that their advantages now, particularly in the air and at sea, are eroding rapidly. And on the ground too. I mean, the United States, its combat power is slightly bigger than the New York Police Department. So all this talk about going into cities and fighting in mega cities, you're not going to do this with a force of 450,000. I mean, this is just madness. So we are going to go to robotics, we are going to go to technology, but at the same time we're also going to keep up our combined arms. We'll go for a qualitative military. We have no choice in the West but to go for a qualitative military because we don't have the numbers. We don't have the mass numbers that the Chinese can put in the field, and we certainly, the Russians at the moment are looking pretty formidable, but you've got to remember that Russia has got a GDP the size of Italy. It's a declining power demographically. So long term, I don't rate the Russians long term. At the short term, they're going to give us a lot of things to worry about, and they're certainly given NATO a lot to worry about. Their average brigade has got twice the indirect fire of a NATO brigade. So there's a lot of disparities, but there's nothing that we can't catch up with if we're prepared to put the money and put the will. I think what's missing in the West is will, a loss of civilizational confidence, an obsession with minor social issues rather than looking at the great geopolitical trends. And that's going to do us in if we're not careful. We really are desperately in need of proper leadership in all the major powers in the West, beginning with the Americans and coming down to our own deplorable political situation here. Sorry to get on my soapbox, but when I see us wasting $50 billion on a bunch of submarines which are never going to hit the water, it makes me want to scream.
So, the second question.
In the discussion, you've alluded to the knockout blow, which the Germans and the French and the British started World War I with. And at the end of World War I, the French and the British were moving away from searching for that knockout blow. Do you see any parallels to us not having learned that lesson in, say, the war in Afghanistan? Was there a search initially in Afghanistan and Iraq for a knockout blow as opposed to winning a series of battles to achieve the outcome?
Looks like it's coming your way, mate.
Look, I'll be the first to say I'm no expert on Iraq and Afghanistan, so I'll keep my comments to a minimum. What develops in 1918 on the Western Front with the French and the British is the beginnings of the so-called operational art. The idea of putting together a sequence of operations to constitute something bigger. Now, okay, it's not that sophisticated. The operational and strategic aim is just get the Germans off French soil. There's no great narrative plan about driving on Berlin or trying to destroy the German government. It's just getting the Germans off French soil. So that operational art, if you like, begins there. How well it's been implemented in Afghanistan and Iraq, well, I'll leave that for others to judge. Anybody who's actually been to Afghanistan, honestly?
Yeah, sure.
I think the key with the operational level of war, the operational art, is you're into successive operations. It's like being in the boxing ring. Instead of going for the knockout punch, you go for a succession of jabs, deep jabs, and you keep hitting the enemy or hitting the guy in the ring until he falls over. So it's a war of attrition, really. And that's what we see on the Western Front, in my view, as a series of attrition. Well, rather a series of successive blows which are qualitatively different from what had gone before because we had the technology. I think in Iraq and Afghanistan, by definition, counterinsurgency is an indecisive form of warfare. It's fundamentally political. You don't get a military result unless you're prepared to do what the Romans did, which is to crucify all the men, enslave the women, and really get down and do it dirty. And that's just not what we're going to do morally in the West. We can't fight that way. So we're never going to win these wars. At best, we'll find a political solution. So the lesson for me of the last 15 years is keep out of coin if you can.
So I might just add to that, I think. That's absolutely true. I mean, you can have an operational scheme all you like, but there is this notion around, and I have to say I hear this from teaching at staff college, I pick up on this frequently amongst the officers that come through, is that there's this notion that if you have an operational plan, and then it can sort of expand that to, if you have a strategy, you'll win. Well, no. You've got to have a workable strategy to win. And I have yet to see anything that approximates a workable strategy in somewhere like Afghanistan, apart from walking away and letting the Taliban take over. There is an opportunity for short-term political walkaways, okay, create some sort of government that might survive and say, it's all yours. But I was thinking about Afghanistan the other week, and after Trump's little mini surge, whatever they're calling it, and there's it just seems to me a complete underestimation about what it takes to create a nation state. If you want to do a nice comparison, when did Britain start? Around about 700 AD, when was what? King Alfred started unifying the previous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and creating England. Well, and when was the Act of Union? 1700 something or other, and even then it's been falling apart since then. That's 1,000 years to create Great Britain, and no nation state is in a permanent state of stability, as we can see in Britain and Spain and all the rest of it today. So anyone who thinks they're going to create a modern nation state in Afghanistan, the only people who can do that are the Afghans, not us.
I also think we need to look at ourselves a little bit as military planners or potential military planners, and that being we're the ones that provide the best military advice to our political leaders. So we're the ones that set the expectation for our political leaders on what success and the time frame of what success would look like. Now, a lot of the foundations of that advice is sometimes brought forward on failed or uneducated planning, because we haven't been able to define ourselves is what is the state that we're looking for when we walk away. We understand what it might look like today, and if that was a flat line, zero base, what are we prepared to accept as a mission accomplished? Is our aim always to get back to zero status, or are we prepared to actually say, no, as a result of injecting a military force onto a society and the effects of that, we're actually going to say that the outcome might actually be a little bit higher on a scale, that is a 1 or a 2. We're never actually going to be able to get back down to 0. So in terms of that planning, it's the expectation management and thereby the advice that we provide higher as well.
Okay, well, I think we might call it quits at that stage, and thank you guys very much for those questions, and thank you to the audience of yours.